I am Kevin Lerner. I am the chair of the Department of Communication at Marist and an associate professor of journalism. I fell into journalism sort of backwards. I was told from the time I was in high school that I was a good writer, so I knew I wanted to do something involving writing, and I was an English major as an undergraduate. And by the time I was a sophomore, I'd gotten kind of tired of writing essays about poetry and Victorian novels. But I had found my way into a magazine at the college, which did real reporting, mostly on cultural issues. And by the time I graduated, it was either law school or journalism school. And I got into a better journalism school than I got into a law school, and that kind of tipped me into this career. Can't be a good writer without having information to write about. I learned in my first semester in my master's program in journalism that no matter how good you are with words, you can't write around a story that you haven't reported well. That it becomes clear instantly that you don't know all of the things you're talking about. So it's not that it's necessarily a balance between one and the other, but it's that you can't get to the writing or the storytelling, which doesn't even have to be writing. It can be video storytelling, it can be photographs, it can be data storytelling, but you can't do it without having that foundation of the research. I think the thing I like best about teaching journalism at Marist is that it's a pre-professional program with this big liberal arts foundation that we have here. And that means that students come out of our program with the ability to think critically, to question the world around them, and to ask questions about why they do things the way they do things. It's not just that we're training you for your first job at a journalism institution, it's that we're teaching you how to think about how journalism behaves in a democratic society and really question what the best ways to do that are. I think we're at a really interesting time in journalism history in that, and my work is personally as a historian of journalism, we're at a moment when we don't really know what the future is going to be, and that's why it's so important to study the liberal arts along with journalism, because you can invent that next future of journalism and not take for granted the systems and processes that came before. I think one of the most prominent things is that the journalists themselves are much more visible. Not only do people recognize particular bylines because they interact with those people on social media, but the journalists themselves are much more involved in telling the story. And I think it becomes harder to have a pretense of knowing everything. And a journalist who comes in with absolute certainty that their information is all correct and will never change, I think doesn't get the same kind of trust from an audience that they would have a generation ago when journalists seem to have sort of a voice of God. And so journalists have become much more human in ways that I think are good. Some of that is on society, I think. I think what a journalist needs to do is be as honest and open about where their information is coming from, what they know and they don't know, and not to try to pretend to know everything or to be the only correct answer. There was an age from about the beginning of the 20th century until really the end of the 20th century when there was one mainstream mass media that most people took as the press. And I think that is sort of fragmenting a little bit. So I don't think there's any pretense that one journalist can speak to everybody anymore. Which doesn't mean you have to pander to a particular audience, but to know that you're not going to be trusted by everybody. And I think individual journalists have always known this. Even if they're part of that 20th century mass media, they knew they were going to get more hate mail than anything. It's going well. I am writing a book about three journalists who left the New York Times in the 1960s, early 1970s, and then sort of went on to careers where they created an alternative to that daily mainstream journalism. This new book about the three journalists is a little bit more commercially viable, I hope, in that it's telling the stories of real people. So one of the three journalists I'm writing about in this new book, a guy named Tony Lucas, played a large role in that first book. And as I was writing my book, I just found his life and the decisions that he made fascinating. And I wanted to pursue those human beings, the actual people who made the historical decisions that my first book, which is a little bit more about general topics like press criticism, could really go into those human stories.
So that's everything I had planned. Is there anything you would like to add? Anything you want to get out for the camera?
I don't think so.
Okay.
But you're a good interviewer.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I learned from the best.
Yeah? Who's that? Basinger?